Morning, Laura, and evening, Grace, America. Hugh Hewitt in Studio West. Starting off this Tuesday with Haviv Rettig Gur from Israel. Good morning, Haviv, or afternoon where you are. Thank you for joining me. Congratulations, by the way, on the new podcast, which gave me the prompt to call you back. Ask Haviv anything. I think it's fascinating. Is it taking off?
Yeah, it's doing pretty well. We have subscribers in the 5 digits and downloads in the 6 digits, and I'm on episode 7. So what more could you hope for?
Well, I want to talk to you about episode 6, but first I want to ask you about some breaking news. This morning, Gadi Taub released an interview with Prime Minister Netanyahu. Now, I'm reading it in subtitles because they're talking in Hebrew, and I've noticed a few things. I'm only going to ask you about one, which is that the Prime Minister says America stood with us initially. Then he talks about Biden's threat to cut off more than the 2,000 bombs, but plenty of things. And about what makes news the most in this interview, or anything at all?
I think that I did not see the interview go travel very much in Israeli media, including, by the way, in pro-Netanyahu media. In other words, Channel 14 is a very pro-Netanyahu channel in Israel. And I didn't see it make dramatic headlines. Netanyahu made arguments that he's made before. His I think his fundamental argument, he made it at the Knesset, and that video was broadcast in many places, and he made it in various interviews, is that he won the war. The war seems to be going very favorably for Israel. Iran seems to be on its back feet. Gaza is not a victory. Hamas still exists in Gaza, but Gaza really can't rebuild with Hamas in charge, and that, in a sense, and the kind of war Hamas built Gaza really to be for 17 years, the kind of war Hamas planned, in which civilian deaths is Hamas's strategy for survival, that is basically an Israeli victory. And Netanyahu is trying to ride this Israeli perception that things have shifted in the last 5 months in the Middle East, and Israel really has the upper hand going forward. And to say, I did this, and if the opposition was in charge, then, a lot of Israelis are very angry with him. Right wing Israelis, he was the prime minister on October 7. He was the man whose strategy led us to containment of deterrence, led us to October 7. And now he's saying, I'm also the guy who turned us around. And so that was what that interview, I think, was for. It was to the base, and it's a legitimate interview. It's an interesting interview. I'll just say one little piece of criticism that I think is really fundamental. He gives very few interviews with the press, and he gives no interviews at all with the press that doesn't favor him. I mean, he's gone months at a time with not a single media interview in the middle of a war. And so it was part of Netanyahu's ongoing campaign to survive October 7, essentially, politically.
Were you surprised at all? Because this is what surprised me as an American watching the war, that the United States pressure grew so dramatically right down to that meeting that the prime minister recounts in the prime minister's office when Biden tells him to stop and not to go into Rafah. I mean, is any of that news to you? Because if it is, it's news to me, and I don't know that the American media covered it.
I didn't know about a specific moment when Biden made that specific statement, but the Biden administration for 4 months, roughly between February and May of last year, said that openly. In other words, it said, you will not go into Rafah. Remember Kamala Harris as vice president saying, I've seen the maps. It's not doable, right? I don't know what maps she saw. The Biden administration said things about not going into Rafah that were patently ridiculous. There were, it would take 4 months, they said, to move the civilians out in order to fight Hamas. Well, it ended up taking 12 days. I'm not sure the Biden administration really had a good sense. Literally the National Security Council under Biden had a good sense of the size of Gaza. I always imagined that with the kinds of statements they made about Rafah, about Gaza, it always seemed as though on one wall in the National Security Council briefing room, they have a map of Ukraine, and on another, they have a map of Gaza, and the maps are the same size. So they kind of assumed Gaza is this enormous place. Gaza is a 25-kilometer territory, and maneuverability in Gaza is very easy. It's anyway. I think Israel did fairly well in this war, better than could be expected. Not every airstrike was okay. Not every Israeli operation was successful. Civilians died. That was Hamas's fundamental strategy. Does that mean I think Israel's 100% okay? Absolutely not. But the Biden administration had an incoherent policy, not because it really believed Israel was behaving insanely in Gaza militarily, but because it was constantly with one eye on domestic politics. And it meant that President Biden told Israel not to win, which was a silly thing to say that dragged out everybody's suffering, including Gazan civilians.
In this brand new book, Fight, next time I'm talking to the authors, Jonathan Allen and Amy Parnes, it reveals that President Biden uh, lacked a lot of cognitive ability, at least in the last year of his presidency, probably in the last 2.5 years of his presidency. Have you heard anyone in Israel discuss that?
I think I'll put it really simple. I mean, you don't talk to the president much in foreign policy. It's much more likely that senators dealing or members of Congress dealing with the federal budget would speak to the president than it is that Israeli defense ministers would interact directly, consistently with the president. So I have not heard that from Israeli officials,
It's pretty
but there's no
shocking.
reason you would think that.
Yeah, I get it.
It's
There's
not
no
that I don't
reason.
believe it.
Yeah. When you read
Yeah.
it, when you get a chance, you'll be appalled. I was appalled. Let me move on to the Ask Haviv Anything, episode 6, because I used it to teach my class this week. I teach constitutional law, and I began by asking them, what is the rule of law? It was very confounding. Normally we do cases, holdings, 5-4 split, 6-3 split. What's the dissent say? That's basic con law. But I started with this rather general question, what is the rule of law? And it was provoked by your discussion of the Israeli judicial reform. And that's because I did not realize until Saturday that under the current system, which will remain in effect until this law takes effect, which only will happen if a new Knesset after the next election upholds it, that you need 5 out of 9 members of the Judicial Selection Committee to vote for you, and that 3 members of the Judicial Selection Committee are judges. So they have a veto. I never realized
Yeah,
that.
7
They
out.
have a veto. That's incredible
Yes.
to me. And I asked the students, and I compared it to the Mexican Supreme Court, which has 11 members. Our Supreme Court has 9 members. Your Supreme Court has 15 members. It doesn't matter how many members you have. What matters is what is the rule of law. So let me begin with the question. What do you think the rule of law means, Habib?
I think it's a set of agreed upon rules. And if you have it, your country can function without political violence. And if you don't have it, countries fairly quickly won't function without political violence. And so it's everything. Democracy depends on it. If you don't have that set of agreed upon rules that are incidentally enforceable for people stepping out, but if everybody violates them, then you can't enforce them anyway. So you both have to have social agreement, and then you have to be able to enforce it on the margins that don't agree with the set of rules. And that's the fundamental thing. I do think Israel has it. We just have this insanely powerful court as part
If
of
the
our rule
court
of law,
strikes
and it's
down this
unhealthy.
new law, if they actually strike it down before it has a chance, before there's another election, will Israel have the rule of law or really have the rule of 15?
It's it's a good question. It's a fascinating question. It's also a theoretical question because there is a point where the Supreme Court becomes a parody of itself, and it knows that that's a dangerous place for it to go. You had at the beginning of this government in January of 2023 70% support for judicial reform. Most of the public supports judicial reform. My point was to argue in that podcast episode and lay out that argument very carefully was that that collapsed to 25% support. But it's not because people don't support judicial reform. It's because the government really badly mishandled it. It was a very politicized and very incompetent, I think. And I think they know that. In other words, there's been a
Oh, I
massive
think you made
retreat from
that
the vast majority of that.
you made that point very well. I'm worried
Right.
that if they strike this
But in other words, the
down,
public won't allow it. The
right?
public won't
But
allow it.
what are the? Let me take a quick break here. I'll come right back. Haviv Rettig Gur is my guest. I'm back with Haviv Rettig Gur. We were talking about the Supreme Court in Israel has a law before it, a new judicial reform law. I don't know when the hearings are going to happen, but if they strike that down, Haviv, I really am going to wonder whether or not Israel has a rule of law. And would you share my worry if that happened?
I'll tell you why not. Because theoretically, I should, right? It's a far too powerful court. And incidentally, the court has struck down other laws and even struck down government decisions. on the theory that they violate basic laws, which are not quite constitutional. They're not hard to change. You change them just like you change any other law, but they are called basic laws, and they sort of lay out the fundamental rules of the system. So they're kind of a pseudo constitution, a very weak constitution. On the theory that a particular law violates a basic law, contradicts a basic law, the court has struck down other laws. Well, the court has, in the last year, actually struck down a basic law amendment. And now the question is, on what grounds? What's the constitutional grounds, reasonability, all these kinds of things that are essentially the judges saying, we know you don't know. The court has argued about itself that it is, I'm going to paraphrase unfairly to the judges, but why not? Sort of the child with the finger in the dike holding back the flood. In other words, you can't trust the politicians. You have to keep the system democratic. We're the only people keeping the system from being overtaken by this majority tyranny that the Knesset wants to impose, that the coalition government wants to impose. That is not as silly as it sounds, because we don't have a House and a Senate with vetoes and a president with a veto and a whole vast complicated system of electing in different ways, in different fashions, on different timelines like you have. We have almost no checks in our system at all other than the court. And so the court isn't being stupid, but it also doesn't have the grounds to be the only solution. I think that if the court does that, that'll be a good thing. If the court massively oversteps its bounds and just claims a power it has no grounds to claim, and then essentially forces an election to be on the court's power, if that happens, then that's a good thing, because Israelis will finally seriously pay attention to this question and deal with it. And if the court doesn't do that, which is what I suspect, because it would be really a breaking of the system, then I think the politicians will have to be responsible in creating a much more serious, carefully worded, serious constitutional law, talking about the court's powers, talking about other checks and balances in the system in ways the Israelis don't have. I'm sorry for speaking at 30,000 feet, but we can dig into it.
No,
It's
it makes
interesting,
sense to me. I am reminded of the crisis in English history that occurred, I think, in the 1830s, where Parliament passed a reform bill and the Lords vetoed it, and they immediately went to an election, and the House of Commons majority was returned, and the Lords threatened to veto it again, and the King said, then I will create as many Lords as is necessary to uphold the bill. And then the Lords passed it. That's a constitutional crisis. You might be in one if they strike this law down. I don't think you're in one right
we
now.
might be in one, but packing the court is something the Knesset has an explicit power to do. The size of the court is based on the basic law of the judiciary, and the Knesset can change the basic law of the judiciary. In the end, the Knesset will win. I do really appreciate, I don't like how the right has done this. I don't like how the right has tried to reform the court very badly and very aggressively in ways that frankly played into the court's own argument about its power and the necessity for its power. And again, we can get into it, but the right really overstepped this. There are very few people on the Israeli right today that don't think that the right mishandled this very badly. But at the same time, I don't mind a constitutional crisis that forces everyone to solve this, for a very simple reason. Israel's democracy is so fundamental and built in so deeply to its culture. We don't have a freedom of speech anywhere in Israeli law. We don't have freedom of religious practice. We don't have freedom of assembly. We don't have almost any freedoms at all. Incidentally, Australia has no Bill of Rights also, and never really needed one because it's so built into the culture. So we are one of those democracies that demonstrate that democracy really can flow from culture and not from complex constitutions. I think now things are a little bit falling apart because the country is so big and the population is so much bigger, wealth, power, questions of war, questions of justice, questions of minorities. We can no longer just kind of live off the culture of democracy. So that culture is there. It's not going to fall apart, but we do need to start getting seriously thinking about constitutions.
And that brings me to
not
the second big question, because I really do recommend everyone ask Haviv anything, especially the episode 6, which is about the judicial reform and about what I did not understand about Israel is the number of tribes, and that is small t tribes, whether it is Tel Aviv, secular Jews, religious Jews in Jerusalem, Haredim, of many different varieties, the Bedouin, the Druze. There are tribes all over the place. And in the back of my mind, framed the question, do you have affirmative action there? Is there a DEI in Israel? Because DEI in the United States has divided the United States very badly. In fact, the last election was a DEI election, and affirmative action was ruled unconstitutional 2 terms ago by the Supreme Court. Finally, completely, 100%. There had been a little bit left over for affirmative action in higher education. That's gone now. Does Israel have an affirmative action system at all for all these different tribes?
There's some measure of affirmative action, and it's more government programs that favor certain groups. So it could be women, it can be minorities, it can be, but it's not systemic and it's not built in to legal requirements of most institutions and things like that. Without any affirmative action whatsoever, women are more than half the judges of Israel. When you see a woman at the top of Israel's judiciary, that is entirely representative of the entirety of the judiciary all the way down the chain. With zero affirmative action, the University of Haifa is, I think, over 40% Arab, and it's a very, very good university. And the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, the highest ranked university in Israel, is a quarter Arab. And that's without any of those kinds of affirmative action programs. And so
Interesting.
we have them at the margins, mostly in the public service. They're
How
not
does
the
admissions
reason.
work at the universities? Because that was the last bastion of race consciousness and intersectionality consciousness in the United States, and it's gone now. But how does it work? How do you get into the best universities in Israel? Is it just one test?
Well, yeah, mostly grades and tests. There's not so much interviews and appeals and a process of reading your essays. That is, it's students. It's important to remember, because there's national service, because there's military service or a kind of national volunteering program that many religious people take who don't want to serve in the military. People arrive at college a little bit older and a little bit keener, and Israelis generally marry younger than they do generally in the West, and so they're a little bit more trying to get work done, right? They're trying to get their degree to go off to live their lives. And so colleges are much, much more professional. We don't have that whole college campus life that you do. It's not a 4 year
Oh,
sort of post high school education camp kind of experience. It's much, much more embedded. I, for example, worked a 40-hour work week while I was a student because I had to pay my way through college. So that's the general experience.
is there a system in Israel where embedded elites help each other? I've just been rereading David Halberstrom's The Best and the Brightest, and it's a real through the looking glass, backwards glance at 1972. And it's not good what you see there. You see elites everywhere running things, running them badly, running us into Vietnam. But it was run by elites for elites, and they made elite mistakes. Do such elites exist in Israel that give each other helping hands, hands up, hands washing hands?
Yes, absolutely. And not only that, but because it's a country with deep ethnic divides and deep religious divides within the ethnic groups. In other words, within the Jews, there are these very different religious groups. And because it's a country of immigration waves, German Jews and Polish Jews today all just look like European Ashkenazi Jews. But in the 1950s, it was very important to German Jews that they were not Polish Jews, and they looked down on Polish Jews. And there was actually some sort of cultural tension between a Supreme Court that had a lot of German Jews in the early years of the state and the fact that David Ben Gurion was Polish, right? So that was a big difference. But then come Moroccans and Iraqis and all kinds of different Jewish communities from the Arab world and from the Muslim world, and they can't break into these new elites, and decisions are made for them by a mostly Ashkenazi political elite that makes decisions about where to settle an incoming population. Israel has about 650,000 citizens at its founding. Israel will have double that, 1.3 million, 4 years later, as Iraq empties out en masse of Jews as they flee. In Iraq, that had basically spent the war years being Nazi. And so you had in Israel these mass waves of immigration, a country struggling to deal with these mass waves, and a lot of marginalization by these entrenched elites. Prime Minister Netanyahu campaigns on this every election, and it's the fact that he can campaign and win by telling Arab world Jews, Mizrahi Jews, who are who are a majority of his core base, that he can tell them that there's still an Ashkenazi elite on the court, that there's still an Ashkenazi elite in the state apparatuses and in the military and all of that, means that people still feel it. In other words, there's enough there to base a campaign on. I'm actually personally very critical of that. We've already had a Persian chief of staff of the IDF. We have Mizrahi Jews on the court, and by the way, Netanyahu hasn't appointed many. Has very rarely actually appointed a Mizrahi Jew to the high court, right? But the campaign has resonance, which means that ordinary people, still experience it. And when you take the Arab-Jewish divide, I think that divide is even larger. There's very much a sense that it's a Jewish political space, and Arabs are everywhere, in every high-tech company, in every, just, and they're entering high-tech industry on merit. They're a huge percentage at the Technion, our finest technical college, our MIT. But it's slow, and there's growth. It's good. It's something that's happening. It's changing. They're more and more in the judiciary, more and more in the police, more and more in these important systems. But there's absolutely a sense that there's an elite, and it's been a problem that entire
So,
political
last
campaigns
question,
have.
Aviv. Yeah, long term, when you're my age, can a state as small as Israel survive with an elite that is known to prefer its own? In America, where frontier farms and factories basically leveled the whole place out, there is no tribe. There was an elite on the East Coast. It's been destroyed. Legacy admissions are over. It's basically a flat plain with some interruptions for merit, but it's basically a flat plain. Can Israel exist long term with this many tribes with that distinct set of identities? And I go from Bedouin to Druze to Jerusalem Jews to Tel Aviv secularists. It just doesn't seem to me like it'll always come together when it needs to come together.
That's a very good question. It's who we are. It's like asking the Lebanese if Lebanon can survive when it has so many different tribes. Ironically, in Lebanon, it's an even better question because it's not clear that it can. The answer is yes. The answer is, I really, it's such an important thing to explain because the terms mean different things here than they do in America. We have a political left that has military service rates of probably 75%. You don't have that on your political left
No,
in America, right?
no.
Our secular progressive left has more kids per woman than any developed nation in the OECD. That is, again, not something that exists in America.
Agree.
And so when you're talking about Israel's tribes, there's a sense of shared fate, maybe because we're all Jews, all refugees from the 20th century. But there's a sense of shared fate that holds us together, even at the worst, even when we're at each other's throats. The very war over judicial reform was a war in which everybody said, you're breaking apart our solidarity. In other words, to to discuss this deep fissure in our society, everybody appealed to and tried to access that sense of deep unity and solidarity. So we have, ironically, we're probably among the most fractured of societies, among the most diverse of societies. How many societies in the world have people whose grandparents are Polish have to live with people whose grandparents were Yemeni, and hundreds of thousands of each all living together? Um, the prosecutors of Benjamin Netanyahu, who he likes to call elite, are actually Mizrahi. They're actually Jews from the Arab world. Their grandparents came from the Arab world. Netanyahu himself is a wealthy Ashkenazi Jew. So a lot of this stuff it's falling apart. I have a friend whose last name is Deutsch. That
Huh.
literally is German for
Huh.
German.
Yes.
But every time her mother has a birthday, all the daughters pick up mom and take her to the Kotel, to the Western Wall in Jerusalem, to pray, because her mother is a very traditional Moroccan. And so I have a friend whose name is Deutsch, who's half Moroccan. The other half, of course, is German, but she's half Moroccan. So many Israelis are now, I would say a majority at this point, are half and half of something. My own very close friend is Tunisian, Turkish, Romanian. Each grandparent is something else. So it's merging, it's melding. These identities still have power, but they are less and less over the years. And the solidarity is profound and measurable. And you saw it in the war. Left and right
Very
went to
last
war
question.
together
Every
and we
time a
fought together.
bone fractures, if you're young, it reknits stronger. I shouldn't say every time, but it is almost always the case that when a young person breaks a bone, that bone reknits into a stronger bone. Will that follow this awful 18 months, and it might be another 6 months before it's over? Will it reknit differently and stronger in Israel?
It already has. We had a founding generation of leaders who, after 30 years of building a country out of not a country, out of a bunch of diasporas, a bunch of refugee groups, retired in poverty. Ben Gurion retired to a shack in the desert And Menachem Begin, the great right-wing leader from the founding of the state, retired to a rented apartment in a working-class neighborhood in Jerusalem. And then we had a second generation of leaders who grew up fighting in the young state, Rabin and Peres, and they were middle class, but they were not more than middle class. And then we had the next generation, the Olmert, the Barak, the Netanyahu, who became wealthy in public service. And there was a much more hedonistic culture. I'm not blaming them specifically. It's a whole different Israel. It's a much wealthier Israel. And there was a sense that they're looking out for themselves, and there's suddenly corruption scandals, and there's suddenly all these things. Olmert, people might not remember, went to prison for corruption, for taking bribes in office. There is a new generation, and you saw it in the war. Young people going off to the war, knowing that they're left-wingers and right-wingers, Ashkenazi and Mizrahi, Bedouins fighting alongside Jews because Hamas killed 50 Arab Israelis on October 7th. And there's a vengeance that the Bedouin wanted to take on Hamas in the beginning of the war. They put out TikTok videos about themselves getting on helicopters as soldiers going into Gaza. And so there's a unity there, a sense that there's this vast Iranian array of proxies against us. And that unity drove a kind of solidarity that they then looked at our current political class and said, we can do better than this. We can go back to the Rabin Peres years. We can go back to the Begin generation. And so there's a whole new generation of political activists being born in this war who want a country that expresses the solidarity and doesn't run on the divides and the fractures. So yes,
Oh,
I think
very
we're going to come.
optimistic. That's a great place to end. I want to congratulate you again. The brand new podcast available at Apple, iTunes, Spotify is Ask Haviv Anything. What's your schedule of production, Haviv? One a week? Twice a week?
About one a week.
All right. I want more, but I leave that to you. Thank you, Haviv Rettig Gur. Always a pleasure speaking to you.
Thank you, Hugh.